So, welcome back to the next session of this Swayam course that aims at integrating pedagogy and content in the context of material science and engineering education. I suspect this will also be relevant for those of you who are educators in allied domains, allied fields, which essentially encompasses almost any discipline within science and engineering. Today, this will be more or less the plan of the lesson. So, we will have a recap as far as the pedagogy is concerned, and we will also look at what are called as learning theories. So, primarily to understand how human beings learn, and as a consequence figuring out how we need to design our lessons in the context of our own classrooms and also in the context of the various mentoring services that we might be offering to our students. And we will also have pedagogic discussion here. So, we have a group of students and I will ask some questions which I think is relevant from the point of view of getting a feel for what students are likely to believe about these approaches that are being tested and tried in these classrooms. As far as content is concerned, I will certainly prioritize this for today's session, but if time permits, we will try to move on and get started with polymers, another very important category of materials whose primary strength is that they are for all practical purposes printable, castable, and hence provide tremendous opportunities in terms of three-dimensional fabrication in general, and materials fabrication I think is certainly made easier, more amenable using polymeric approaches. So, just so that there is a sufficient recap of what we have been discussing as far as the pedagogy is concerned, I would like to go through in brief the kind of topics and concepts we have covered so far, so that this session is made accessible to all of you. So, as a recap, I introduced this idea of pedagogy, and I said that this is very important especially for our MS PhD students because self-directed learning is the kind of learning that we would like them to engage in, wherein you create a scaffold and you basically provide them with relevant directions, but at the same time they determine their learning and take ownership of their learning in a great way. Arguably that is possible even at slightly lower levels in university education, and it depends upon how we use the Bloom's taxonomy to our advantage in designing our course and designing our questions and so on and so on. Andragogy is what university educators usually do, that includes me, which essentially is a set of principles and practices to instruct adult learners, and this is clearly a bunch of adult learners, and in the classroom settings that you have, clearly there are going to be students who are adults. So, we ought to sort of understand the backdrop of these learners and present material content and also contextualize and offer relevance on a need basis and in an appropriate manner. Pedagogy is sort of what both of these come under for all practical purposes, because it is a method and practice of instructing an academic subject. So, we all practice pedagogy, and based on whether we are teaching adults or not, we are practicing andragogy. And based on whether or not there is a lot of self-determined learning in our classrooms or with our students, there will be a lot of pedagogy that we will be participating in. We did talk about the importance of learning environments, and in fact if you look at research literature, not just in engineering education but education research in general, there is a very widespread understanding and appreciation for the fact that the quality of instruction, the quality of educational experience to a large extent depends upon the teaching learning environment we offer to the students. So, the way the students interact with them and with one another, with the instructor, certainly depends upon the environment that we offer to the students. So, that is a very important part of what I think we can think about, university administrators can think about. Active cooperative learning is a phrase that I did introduce a little while ago, and you saw the examples of those in this particular classroom setting, wherein you saw students actively discussing with one another, finding out information by themselves, trying to design solutions on their own. So, you provide them with some kind of a framework and a scaffold, and they essentially guide one another, and this is very well known to be a much more effective way of ensuring learning outcomes or intended learning outcomes when compared to the traditional lecture approach. Guided reading and writing. In fact, we started this session by giving some props in the form of some printed material, and we asked students to go through that. You can also give, let us say, a framework in the classroom and ask students to go through relevant reading material and make them responsible for it. Think, Pair, Share is one of the methods that we used in the context of active cooperative learning. Participatory learning and action is very important and very essential for today's learner, especially in an increasingly collaborative world wherein they learn together and they are open to sort of discussing and engaging in a learning dynamic with one another. This requires a certain attitude development, a habit development, not very widely seen in our societies. That has to do with the fact that classroom settings tend to be very monologue driven. But today's learners are going into a very collaborative world, a convergent world where there are large number of disciplines that are coming together, and as a consequence I really believe that participatory learning and action brings enormous value to all kinds of students, including engineering and science students. So collective, creative and critical thinking was a phrase that I emphasized a while ago, and this is something to think about, especially given that the future depends upon how creatively people can express themselves. I think most of the jobs that require repetitive activity will be taken up by automation. So the human being's primary role would come down to creative action, and participatory learning and action provides a platform through which they can learn about collaboration and also collective creativity, collective critical thinking. Very important for knowledge creation, of course, but also for the sustenance of our society. Scaffolding, I discussed this at some depth in this particular class. I talked about Vygotsky's scaffolding techniques, wherein you create a framework and you ask the students to fill the framework. So there is a lot of participation from the student in the learning activity. So the learning activity is action driven, where the student does quite a bit of activity, and the more the activity is, the greater tends to be the learning. The more designed, well designed the activity is, the more the achievement of intended learning outcomes are likely to be, and it's the design of those activities wherein our own creativity as instructors can be exercised. So I talked about minute paper, and maybe we will do a minute paper exercise today also. So it's a very quick way of getting some feedback that is informative and formative for the instructor. You ask the student a very pointed question which requires not an elaborate answer but a very to the point, precise, bulleted answer perhaps, and you can get feedback. It could be to do with content that you have covered, concepts that you have covered, but also classroom experience. The next thing is the concept of teacher as a facilitator, and this is very important, and in this classroom setting also I hope I have communicated the fact that we would like to move away from a monologue, ask pointed questions, and then the teacher basically provides information so that the props that are available to the students are helpful for the students' learning and engagement. So instead of emphasizing instruction, you emphasize design and facilitation in your classrooms. Of course, this becomes somewhat challenging in very large classroom settings, and research is ongoing to find out how, let us say, technology intervention can be used in large classroom settings so that teacher as a facilitator model works just as fine even in large classroom settings. In the meantime, instead of waiting for solutions, I think we can come up with our own design experiments, do action research in our own classrooms, and find ways to engage our students. Connected to Vygotsky's scaffolding is the zone of proximal development, which is the difference between a guided student and an unguided one. So all students can learn on their own, they can figure things out on their own. Arguably, though they could do things without a teacher, without a university, they could just learn on their own. However, the gap that exists between a facilitated learner and an unfacilitated learner is described by using the zone of proximal development, and in fact our approach should be to make sure that problem solving skills, which are typically in very great need in today's society, is enabled through that zone of proximal development. Okay. Learning outcomes and objectives are pointed statements regarding program outcomes, course outcomes, and in fact you can also write down learning objectives and program outcomes for your bachelor's course, master's course, PhD courses and so on, and the more clear we are about the program outcomes, the more we are likely to design the student experience and hence facilitate the students' growth and professional development. Instructional scaffolding is a related concept, and we discussed this in in the session that was a couple of sessions ago or so. And the important thing in scaffolding is to provide this one. This I would actually highlight. It is providing the right context for the students to learn. The students also used mind map, knowledge trees, and I also talked about ViewGraph, software that is very helpful in making a quick concept map. So you have a bunch of connected ideas. How those ideas are connected can be done by using a set of bubbles and arrows that might be unidirectional, bidirectional or whatever, and we could create maps. And in this particular classroom, for instance, you might recall that students came up with a very nice concept map on bonding, structure and some related atomic properties, and that was actually a very meaningful exercise, I think, because typically students are taught these things in disconnected, disjointed chapters. But here you sort of get the students to think about it in an integrated manner so that they know how to facilitate their own thinking. Concept map is a related idea, that is what we covered here, point number 14. So mind map, concept map, spider maps I talked about. Now ontology, this is a very interesting idea, and those of you who are teachers, if you look at education research articles, you will find this again and again. Now ontology has to do with the nature of knowledge. Okay, so say for example, a simple way for an engineering or science instructor to think about this, or a student to think about it, is when you make the concept map, you are sort of saying this is how the body of knowledge is. This is the structure of the body of knowledge. So I have different ideas that are actually important, different concepts, cornerstone ideas, principles, laws that are there in my discipline, and they are connected to one another in a particular way. So this is what it is. So that is what ontology is. Ontology has to do with the nature of the knowledge. Ontology in material science can be different from ontology in chemistry. There could be overlaps, there could be dissimilarities. Ontology in electrical engineering could be different from ontology in mechanical engineering and so on. But in all of these cases, you can use this idea of ontology as a connected set of concepts which results in the nature of knowledge in your own discipline. And there is a lot of evidence that the human mind actually assimilates and accommodates knowledge in that particular manner, and that is why concept maps are so effective. They are so relevant as a teaching aid, as a teaching tool, and it costs nothing, because the students can actually draw it on their notepads and so on and so on. So ontological maps or semantic maps, knowledge maps such as spider maps or tree diagrams or concept maps are very helpful, and in fact Google is increasingly using something called the knowledge graph project, and in fact Google's machine learning platform uses ontological maps for their search algorithms and so on and so on. The next one is Bloom's taxonomy. I told you about how the kind of design of the problem can be posited at different levels. Now there is a common question among educators: should you actually ask a create level question to an undergrad? Maybe you should ask something at this level, but I personally believe that at all levels you need to actually engage students all through this particular pyramid, and the more you sort of take them through cycles, the more there is reinforcement of learning. So that reinforcement of learning, I think, happens when you sort of provide students with opportunities to sort of work in different levels of the pyramid, but in an iterative manner, in a consistent manner, so that it becomes a habit for them to analyze, apply, do critical thinking, ask questions to themselves, do some deep reading, deep learning, and so on and so on. Okay, so in the context of create thinking and create questions, I asked a problem to do with magnetic refrigeration. The problem was, we know how gas phase refrigeration works, vapor phase refrigeration works. Can we come up with perfectly analogous refrigeration technique? And that was a create level question, and students here in this class actually came up with a semi-reasonable answer. Need not be complete, but that's not the purpose of this particular process. The purpose is to actually help the students realize that they can come up with solutions. They're enabled, empowered, and information is, if guided and channeled, can be helpful in decision making, technical decision making included, and so on. Now inclusive education is another concept that we discussed in our class, and this has to do with the fact that our learners come from different backgrounds, might be having various learning capabilities but also learning challenges, and to sort of appreciate where they come from and creating an environment wherein students from all kinds of backgrounds could contribute effectively in the classroom is one of the, I think, perennial problems that educators face, and it's relevant for all of us. I did give some homeworks in this particular context, and by the way, if you look at the assignments that I have given, you will have some time for the assignments. I have asked questions to do with many of these concepts, given some real life examples of classroom settings, and asked which of the following responses, for instance, would be consistent with this principle or this idea or this concept and so on. So that is just to help you come up with your own knowledge map, so that these pedagogical ideas that are being covered will be sort of examined by yourself. You will be able to do some self-determined learning in the process. Today I want to talk about transformative learning and beyond. So I hope I have created a context for claiming that education is a transformative process. It's an interactive process. The student interacts with the material, but the student also interacts with the instructor, interacts with one another. So it is truly an interactive, dynamical process. And in many ways, as a consequence, there are at least a few dimensions associated with learning, and the three dimensions that I have identified here are psychological, convictional and behavioral dimensions. Let me explain what this means. So let us say that you have a first year undergraduate student who enters into a class, or a diploma student who has just gotten into the diploma course entering into the class, and yours is a first course on materials science or engineering that they have taken. So they may not even have a perspective regarding what this course is all about. They wouldn't even know what they are expected to learn, and they may not even know the structure and framework of the intended learning outcomes, and they may not even realize the value of it. So you are dealing with, by and large, a person who is capable, has potential, but doesn't have your experience, and hence doesn't have your perspective. So the question is, what is the perspective that you want your learner to have? What is the transformation you want to see in the person so that certain behavioral changes happen? What are these behavioral changes that we are talking about? For instance, a student may take a fact for a fact and not question the fact. But you ideally would like your students to question the fact, see whether the fact is actually true, test it out if necessary, and gain conviction only through testing. So there is a certain kind of perspective we expect of academic process for all our students, and that involves this rigor in thinking, and that is the behavioral aspect that we are talking about. That is the psychological and the behavioral aspect that we are talking about. So the psychological aspect is the student better understands herself or himself. The student says, yes, this is an interesting subject. This uses skills A, B, C, D, and these are things that are within my handle. This is something that I can do. This seems like something that I will enjoy. This seems like something I can contribute valuably and meaningfully to. So the student essentially, as a consequence, has a psychological transformation. So this is usually the first kind of transformation that you can actually see in a student whom you might have been able to motivate, for instance. Not all students you might be able to equally motivate, but you will always find that there will be students whom, if you engage appropriately, if they engage appropriately, if there is sufficient activity on their end, they may actually have a self-realization, self-awareness of themselves, and also in relationship to the subject, they would have an improved understanding of how they interact with the environment and with themselves and so on. Conviction is development of belief systems that are consistent with educational outcomes. For instance, the laws of thermodynamics is something that is taught to students sometimes even in their high school, but they may not have conviction about it then. They may not have any clear idea. They might write out the equations, but they may not know the limits of it, the scope of it, the applicability of it, the value associated with it, the relevance of the signs that are actually associated with each of the terms and so on. So these become embedded through the learning process. So you provide convictions about the conceptual foundation and your own discipline through this educational process, and then there are behavioral outcomes. For instance, let us say that it's a chemistry student, and the chemistry students is taught about atoms, molecules and extended solids, and then the way they think about the world would be transformed, would be different. Everything they come across, they might wonder what it is made up of, what its structure is, how it could be modified, how it could be transformed, and wonder about the world around them in a way in which they would probably not have wondered but for this particular learning process. So there is a psychological transformation, and it is a transformation that is geared towards creative action of this particular person, analytic action of this particular person. So in this context, with this as the background, the recap, let me ask some introspective questions and for these students, and you don't have to necessarily have had any teaching experience, you just have had to had some kind of learning experience. Okay, so I would like to hear a little bit about some of these issues that might be relevant for you. Discuss just one learning experience, not many, but just one learning experience. So you share your learning experience with him, he shares his learning experience with you, same there. Okay, so discuss just one learning experience that you think transformed the way you think in a substantial manner. Okay, so how do you think that learning experience changed the way you look at the world, or has there been any such learning experience in your life? Okay, so can you think about one experience from your college, from your school, wherever, that changed your approach towards perhaps yourself, maybe the environment that you are part of, maybe towards the subject, it doesn't matter, but transformed you in some way. Yeah. At least psychologically, if not behaviorally, if not convictionally, maybe in all three ways. Alright. So please discuss with one another. You can feel free to talk in any language you want. Okay. You're very welcome, and it is not important that you come up with a right answer or so. There is no right or wrong. You feel free to discuss. You understand the question? It's a slightly philosophical question, but I think very important for college students, isn't it? Yes. Please discuss. So you are discussing, you understand the question, right? Yeah. You understand the question? So you can be a little louder. I would like to listen too and maybe participate. I myself have had some transformative learning experience, so I would like to share too. Yes.
So this is my experience during my 11th standard.
Okay.
So we had a comparison subject.
Okay.
This the faculty who is handling that, he just first explained the basics of programming languages and what are all the basic syntaxes you involve. Then he said coding is not that you think that what software companies do. It's just you can see in day-to-day life. You know how ATMs work, you know how computers in bank work. Everything is behind that coding itself. So he took each part of the programming language. That means you can take for loops, while loops, different syntaxes, class, objects. These and he related with one real life problem.
Oh, beautiful.
So he related that and he gave us a separate exercise to depict the same. You know that you already know a similar kind of situation. You create your own situation, then write your own code for that solving that problem. So he did it in such a way. So after that, whatever subject I take or deal with, I will mostly relate with day-to-day life.
So you started seeing how subjects taught in the classroom connect with the rest of the world because of the way this teacher introduced his own subject. Beautiful, very nice, good. All right, so keep discussing. So you might have more than one transformative learning experience. You are welcome to share with one another. No, discuss with one another. I'll come back.
For example, in our case,
in your
my
case,
case, in my school days, how I inclined towards science more. So, for example, there are some teacher, they have taken some red glasses. So he has taken different kind of objects. So some objects are showing some different colors, some objects are showing black. Then we understood that when we are looking through red, so like some light is absorbed and then complementary color we are showing. We are seeing. So like that, then we are, we were at that time even more interested in science. Like we could explain why something are like blue in color, why trees are green, why skies are like.
So
everything like happening surrounding us. It was there already, but we could explain how it's happening. For example, pressure cooker, how it works. So it was in our school days what we learned. So he knew the principle. Like
You
then
started
we
learning
felt
principles
like,
of day-to-day phenomena, and that was very enjoyable for you.
So we felt like,
And
okay, we know how it works.
yes,
Really. So then
and maybe you also started asking questions, new questions you would not have asked before. Like you started seeing how colors are formed, for example, the origin of colors, and then you would have started asking questions about the color of everything around you. It need not be just green, it need not be just leaves, but the color of your hair, the color of your
can we change
skin,
the
the color of
can we
things
tune
around
the
you.
color, like-
Can you tune the color? Yes, exactly. So that opens up new possibilities for your thinking, isn't it? So, and in fact, maybe that also informs the way you work in future. All right, you might actually take up problems wherein there is color tuning involved or some such, isn't it? So it's very fascinating how some seeding at a high school level can actually influence your thinking in due course.
Then I took science in +2, and then actually, particularly at that time, I was interested in medicine.
Okay.
And now, like for example, when we were falling ill, then we were taking some medicine. Then we learned that these are the formula of this medicine.
Yes,
These are made by this. So we were so much interested. So like
Okay.
that, I took chemistry.
I see, I see. So you got very interested in chemistry that way. So because you started seeing how things like medicines, for instance, work, how colors evolve, and so on and so on, right? How colors can be tuned and things of that sort. Very beautiful. And you started seeing its answer being represented using simple schematics, isn't it? So this is how the molecule is, and hence this is why it looks this way. This is why it has such and such color. It has such and such kind of bonding, it has such and such kind of pi bonding, and hence it absorbs in this particular wavelength. So you start seeing very simple explanations, very beautiful explanations emerging, and you can start wondering, okay, can I come up with similar explanations for other phenomena around me? It could be, as I told you, the color of hair, the color of this thing lying around, the way in which this tube light works, the reason why LEDs glow, and all of these things become a connected set of problems. Otherwise it would have been disparate. It would all be different. But now you are able to have a set of unifying principles that are connected, isn't it? That's true. And in fact, I was telling in the first class, if you recall, about material science, the materials tetrahedron. Where do you think that comes from? That comes from this fundamental conviction that there are unifying principles. You know, that is, once you understand the structure, the synthesis, the structure, the property, performance, and composition, you actually understand the material. You can design a problem, you can analyze any materials class using that. Now that's a very big statement to make, isn't it? So it is almost as big a statement as, look at this, you give me the molecular formula, I will tell you whether or not it will absorb in the visible or some such, right? It is almost as big a statement, but it is a very relevant statement because it informs thinking, because that tetrahedron informs the way every material scientist thinks. So it's a transformative experience as a consequence. It changes the way you look at the world around you. So for instance, a material scientist who has been taught about it might look at these ducts and say, that's interesting, I am seeing that all those things are getting opened up. So clearly there are certain cracks that are propagating in the system. How can I improve this material so that it doesn't propagate anymore? Or they might actually ask questions like, look at this board, you know, it turns out that you are able to mark and you are able to erase it. But that is not true for the stable. Why is that the case? Can we think about a materials tetrahedron based approach to, number one, explain this, number two, come up with a surface that is like this board. Okay, so you start thinking in ways that you would otherwise not think, and at some level that is the zone of proximal development. Okay, so I'm sure that many of you without a university education would still, maybe out of curiosity, keep learning. But what a university environment and ambience is supposed to provide is that freedom for that kind of exploration, learning, thinking, new ways of thinking, new ways of directing your life as a consequence, because it directs your life, isn't it? The reason why some of you are here or most of you are here is because it has directed your life. That kind of thinking has directed your life. So if you think about it, it has transformed your life. That simple lesson somewhere there has transformed your life. It's amazing, isn't it? Yes. So some story from you?
I would say, like, Professor B.S. from our department influenced the way I think when I was in BTech. So when I listened to the lecture, the way he explained the things in a very simple manner, so that will help me to think differently as a before and after listening to it. So that's what I was saying.
I see. So simple explanations appeal to you, and you saw some lectures from Professor B.S. Murthy on NPTEL or some such, and there you actually found that his explanations appeal to you because of its simplicity, accessibility and so on. This, by the way, is I think very important for educators also. So this is a very interesting lesson, isn't it? So he heard some lecture in NPTEL and finds it interesting and uses that as a new way of thinking. It's again quite incredible, because that's the power in this particular case of technology, because these two people would not have otherwise learnt or heard of one another. But now it is available. Some of you who are listening to me right now, listening to them right now, are probably sitting in different countries, in different parts of India and so on and so on. I wouldn't probably meet you in my lifetime, but at some level we are in discussion with one another, and that is quite amazing. And that to some extent is not just the transformative power of education, but the transformative power of technology in education. If you integrate these two platforms, how is it that you can actually create a ripple effect? And I believe in large classroom settings, though the research is on, I really feel that that kind of an integration will be important in creating scalable and customized education made available to the students of the future and also our own students. So some lessons, some transformative learning lessons that you would like to share?
Yeah, when I was in Masters, we saw that different kind of books professor asked to do. Then we were thinking, what is the origin of these books?
Okay.
Means,
where did these books come from?
Yeah, they used to give some references or these things. So that reference that we can improve the formal research on these are what they have experimentally done, and they have summarized like in the paper, and that paper came in form of book. So that time I thought that I want some contribute in this field. So that transformed me for my PhD.
Yeah. So that informed your life decision again, isn't it? It's quite amazing. Yeah.
Then I got into this program.
Very good. So what he's telling is, and this is a curiosity I had when I was little. You know, I enjoyed books very much, and so I would just go to the library and get stuck there, or go to a bookshop and get stuck there. I just wouldn't come out. Because I would be very happily exploring. But at the same time, when you are very little, you do not really realize where all these books come from. Clearly, nobody hatches a book. So where did they come from? And especially while learning science and engineering, there are such difficult, turgid, abstract concepts, so many at once compressed inside a book. Clearly, this person who wrote it couldn't have come up with all of it. It just seems impossible. So where did all of this come from? And then you ask questions regarding, okay, where is the genesis of this idea? Let us say first law of thermodynamics. What is the genesis of it? What is resulted in people developing this conviction that there is a first law of thermodynamics? How did they test it out? And it turns out that there are decades of testing that was done before that equation was written down. And today, essentially, you have those decades and decades of collective cumulative learning that is condensed inside a single book, maybe something that is as tiny as a booklet, right? A small book full of concepts, and we expect our students to learn all of it, which is the mind-boggling thing if you think about it, because let us say there is one result, let us say Kahn-Hillard's result, which we use in physical metallurgy, for instance, and we know that he spent his entire lifetime trying to actually figure that out, but that is a 3 or 2 pager in our textbook. And we expect our students to be able to solve that and 50 other kinds of problems as well. You know, and if you think about it, it's pretty mind-boggling what we expect of our students then, right? Because it seems a little unreal. But at the same time, there is a reason why we expect that, because we think they can build on already existing knowledge if they know what is already covered. So on one hand, we have to sort of balance out this appreciation, this historical appreciation of knowledge, knowing fully well that there was real time that went into development of this. Very, very, very smart people spent their entire lifetime figuring out 1 page worth in our textbook. And then we expect a textbook of 300 pages to be digested by the student. It is something that I think on one hand needs to set certain expectations right. The students should be told that, look here, it is not that all of these things were figured out overnight. You could be one of these people who discovered, and there's a story of discovery. So in my case, it was stories of discovery that were very interesting to me. For instance, something very simple like F is equals to MA and the difficulty people had in agreeing on it. Okay, and there are these volumes and volumes and volumes of back and forth and discussions and debates and arguments and experiments that are actually being reported. And the fact that something so simple can actually be complex as far as conviction is developing the conviction is concerned. So students do take time to develop conviction, to adapt to a certain disciplinary behavior, and to have that kind of a transformation in them. Now, how to scaffold it, how to design it is actually a really $1 million problem in that sense, because it's so hard to do that, right? Because you have lots of smart people, their work distilled together, maybe thousands of smart people, their work distilled together in a 100-page engineering textbook, and you are in a 200-page science book, and then you expect them to actually learn it. So on one hand, of course, students can be motivated to not give up. If they don't understand it is alright, that is the first lesson I think as a consequence. If you don't appreciate it fully, if you don't understand it fully, it's perfectly fine. But give a historical perspective, give a historical appreciation for how difficult knowledge creation can be, and knowledge assimilation and accommodation into the larger body of knowledge is likely to be, right? So that is one thing that he was actually talking to you about, that is, where do these books come from, how did it happen? So it comes from scholarly literature, and scholarly literature in turn comes from God knows how many thousands of PhDs worth of work, right? So it is non-trivial, what you have in hand is very, very non-trivial stuff. And especially teachers in our setting, in our country, have to deal with the fact that they might not have gone through PhD program themselves. Very many universities and institutions and colleges operate on a sub-sanction strength sometimes, maybe do not even have enough PhDs in their roster and so on, and as a consequence this perspective can be missing. So it can be like knowledge that is handed down with no questions asked, which is a problem, because for science and engineering you need to ask those questions. Those questions are very, very, very important. And so I would encourage you to encourage your students in turn to sort of be questioning and to appreciate that if they don't understand it in the first attempt, it is all right. There is always a millionth attempt possible, if not the second, if not the third, they could keep attempting, and that kind of willingness to iterate and revisit is very essential for learning and for having a growth oriented mindset. I think that is very essential. Okay, so
I just remember how I came into research. That was, I think, senior high school days.
Okay.
For example, I remember in on class, one of our teachers, maybe I don't know exactly, I don't remember exactly which class I was in, maybe 8 or 9, when I started learning the reflection of light. So he told us that suppose you are watching a match, and somebody who is having a height more than you in front of you, how can you see that match? And he gave us the hint that you can use the reflection of light. How you make a device so that you can watch the match. Then that time we could not answer, but when we came back, then we thought that for example,
you could miniaturize the person, have an image that is created, and
for example, if we can make on shape like this and this and this, we can put on mirror here and on mirror here, so this light will come here, it will reflect and 45 degree angle. So it will again come to here. This is also placed 45 degree angle, so it will come to your eyes. For example, so it will be like. Yeah,
I understood. So yes, so light enters from here. It comes out from here, so you get to see the person who is up there. Yes, maybe he is up there in the ceiling and you are down here, and there is a ceiling that is separating you from him, but you want to see the person. So one way to do that would be to use multiple reflections, right? You have one. By the way, that is called the kaleidoscope.
Yeah, actually, then I made that. Then we sat told us, yes, this kind of instrument. I mean, these things exist. Then there was some work education or something on subject, so I gave that what I made. So
wonderful.
It was really fine. We started experimenting at that situation.
Yes, yes. It's a beautiful thing, very beautiful thing. Yes. Yeah, any other stories on transformative learning experience? But do you think it is meaningful to think about education as transformational? So another question that I think is very relevant is this. So transformative learning is discussed widely among academic settings, especially in humanities and related disciplines. And even in IIT, for instance, and perhaps in other universities, I have not found this being discussed extensively in physical, chemical or engineering science departments. So I think it is interesting to ask why that would be the case. So can you mull over it? Do you understand the question? So typically humanities departments tend to talk about critical thinking, critical theory, need for thinking with clarity, and so on and so on. And in science and engineering also we emphasize clear thinking, we need critical thinking, but we don't think of human transformation, we don't talk about it as often. I don't talk about this transformation of my student as often as, let us say, my humanities colleagues. Why would this be, and do you think being more aware of it even in an engineering and science setting will be helpful for the students, for the teachers? You understand the question? You understand the question? This is a phenomenological question. That means it's based on my own experience. I have found that humanities educators, for instance, very often talk about transformative learning. It is important that we ensure that our students, their lives get transformed in some sense, their thinking gets transformed in some sense, etc. You talk to English professors here, they would actually talk about that. Talk to history professor here, she will talk about it. The anthropology professor would talk about it. But I have not heard many chemistry, physics or engineering professors talk about transforming through learning, transformative learning. Though we actually mean it, we absolutely mean it, but we don't talk about it as much. But do you think there is, number one, a reason why that might be the case which we need to address? Number two, whether there is value to actually talking about it in explicit terms, both for the teacher and for the taught. You understand the two questions? Number one, why is it that we don't talk about transformation of our students? Maybe our own transformation is also enough. Number two, is there value to talking about it explicitly for us and for our students? So can you discuss this question with one another, please? You understand the question? You follow the question, no? So there are two steps to the question, so please, you can share your ideas. Again, there is no right or wrong. If we do research, we may find some other set of parameters, I don't know. But is this true for you also? Has it been your experience also, number one? Number two, if so, why is there this distinction in learning settings? And do you think there is value to bringing that mindset, that thought, even in engineering and science? That's the question.
So I do think sometimes they do discuss in science and engineering.
Yeah, as we are discussing right now.
Because, for example, someone has achieved something, or maybe someone wanted to do something else, but again they became something else. So these things generally totally neglected. But I think very often we should discuss anything so that can motivate people.
Right, and most importantly, as a philosophy for classroom teaching, right? Because here transformation is not transformation of somebody else; it's transformation of our own students, for instance. And our own transformation, right? So how to design a classroom setting, how to design curriculum, how to design your lessons, how to plan your lessons so that that transformation happens. That's rather critical, isn't it? So talking about it and being aware of it, of course, makes sense, right? What do you think?
The reason why they are not talking engineering thing is like when they frame the syllabus or something which they want to cover in subjects, they prioritize more to the technical part.
So the technical part is emphasized
so
first.
What they think is like, so we have this time frame,
Right.
time as a constraint, so first let us cover this thing. I mean, they sometimes make some compromises even in the technical part. There will be many subjects to deal, but they sometimes neglect some subjects so that they prioritize in the technical part itself. So coming to this transformation part is difficult for them. But if we consider humanities, the priority thing will be this. So they discuss with how human psychological thing is there, how they interact, how they transform syllabus. So they give priority to that and this way.
So what you are saying is that there are different philosophical traditions. Engineering and science deals with matter, things, and while humanities increasingly deals with people, and as a consequence, people become the focal point there, things become the focal point here. But when you are dealing with students in a classroom setting, we are dealing with, of course, content that is to do with things, but we are dealing with people. So a certain synergy, a certain kind of combined, integrated, holistic approach might be helpful, isn't it? So what do you think?
Considering this in engineering is obviously valuable, because if we consider this after students coming out from humanities and after the students coming out from engineering, at some point, Where here they will teach them regarding technical stuff, where here they deal with the psychological part. We can cover that here itself while they are learning.
No, I know, and most importantly here it is, I am not thinking in terms of, let us say, complementary skill sets here. I am thinking in terms of learning environments. So, the question I think that is fundamental is, do I help in setting up a learning environment that is transforming the student in some sense, transforming their thinking in some sense, transforming their behavior in some sense, improving in their conviction creation in some sense, in the domain that I am teaching, and that domain can be technical, but the approach has to be consistent with the humanistic tradition as well. So, because we are dealing with human beings, because we are teaching human beings, right? So, if you are an engineer that is working on a computer all the time, or with a machine, with an electron microscope, it's a slightly different ball game. But when you are teaching about electron microscopy, you are suddenly interacting with people, you are actually interacting with people, and hence the way people learn, they respond, they interact with you, with the machine, all of it matters, right? So, that is why I thought I should actually put this question, because it is in some sense, I hope, a probe for the teachers who are listening to this, because transformative learning in that particular sense can be thought of as a philosophy, as a guiding philosophy, while we design our lessons, while we conduct our lesson plans, while we design classroom activities, and so on. So, how can I actually transform the student in a manner that is consistent with the learning outcomes? How can I help the student transform themselves in a manner that is consistent with the intended learning outcomes? Okay, so as a consequence, it's a very nice philosophical tool. That's what I was coming to. Okay.
I think, for example, in a class, for example, teachers are taking some classes. So some students, do not follow that class. So maybe sometimes, he may score that student, but next day, for example, he is well prepared and he learns something about this. So if he on the next day appreciate that constructively, then I think it will be helpful. And he discuss that, okay, he has transformed, some idea, some learning.
Yes. So what you are trying to say is so it's actually called positive reinforcement. What you are saying is a very important idea called positive reinforcement. Okay. So in some sense, this is giving a positive incentive for a constructive behavior, positive incentive for a certain behavior that leads to the intended learning outcomes, for instance. I mean, in the ideal world, assessment should actually do that too. You know, for instance, there are many assessment theories in education. There is not a single assessment theory, there are multiple. So at least three major paradigms exist. One is actually called the norm referenced assessment, which is very common in the IT system, increasingly common in many universities. So wherein you basically say the students that I am testing, they all form a normal distribution. It may not be true, because the population you are dealing with may not fit the curve. So in such cases, sometimes I have seen that people actually force fit into the curve. That's a very bad thing, because you are going against what the data is telling you. I mean, the demographic you are dealing with may not be necessarily resulting in a score that fits a Gaussian distribution. There is no reason to believe that, right? So in the IIT system, for instance, we also use the curve, but we also have freedom to go beyond the curve, and I hope that is a lesson that people listening to this are also take home, because it's very important. The demographic you are dealing with might be such that it is not fitting the curve, in which case it's important not to force fit into the curve. Okay, so that kind of assessment is actually called the norm referenced assessment. In fact, the GATE exam, the JEE exam, they are all norm referenced, because there is a percentile and what is actually given is the performance of the student with reference to some normative performance, some ensemble performance, some performance of the aggregate student body elsewhere. The second paradigm for assessment is what is called as the criteria-referenced assessment. The criteria-referenced assessment is saying that you will get a good score if you do this. If you can complete this problem, if you can address this kind of problem solving, you have satisfied the criteria, you get a good grade. Now this one is a little bit more clear, and large number of professional agencies use this. So they are not as interested in the norm referencing, they might be interested in satisfying the criteria. You fill this, you become a professional engineer. You are able to build this, you become a professional civil engineer. You are able to design this, you become a professional architect. You are able to conceive a project like this, you can actually enter into this association and so on. So those are what are called as criteria referenced assessments. And then there is something called Eps Ativ Assessment, which I personally like very much. Eps Ativ Assessment is saying that, look here, I am at this level as far as learning in general is concerned. This is the expected outcome of learning. Here is where I am. And as I am learning, I am actually progressing. So I basically go from, let us say, level 0 to level 1 to level 2, level 3 and so on. This is what, let us say, karate does. The karate, taekwondo, kung fu, etc. Right? So you will find that the student starts at 0 and then goes to 1, 2, 3 on some Likert scale. And it's not well defined. What the gap between 0 to 1 is not well defined. But the progress is sort of has some qualitative flavor to it, and it tells the student that he or she is improving. You understand? So and a large number of tests are a combination of, on one hand, this norm reference, the other one what is called as criteria referenced assessment. The Eps Ativ assessment is widely used in diagnostics and also for promotions in organizations and so on and so on. It is very widely used. What he is talking about is called positive reinforcement, and positive reinforcement is sort of incentivizing a good behavior. But you should do it in a very careful manner, because sometimes incentive can actually become more important than the lesson. And then it becomes a very perverse incentive. In fact, it is well known in education research. There is something called perverse incentive effect. Okay. A good example of this, let us say, is the PhD program run by a large number of universities. So they say you have to publish at least so much. Okay, you have to publish at least so much, and this is the absolute measure. We will look at it as a measure of quality. While there is some value to it, and there may be some correlation between that kind of publication output and learning of the student, the truth is we know that it cannot be a one-on-one correlation. You cannot actually establish incremental correlation. One publication equals this much learning, two publications equals this much learning. There is no way in which you can say that. Right? It is very, very difficult to define the gap between the numbers there. And since you cannot give a meaning to that gap, you should be very careful, because if you prioritize just some numbers against learning, numbers will become more important than learning, and then it becomes a perverse incentive. Okay, it can become a perverse incentive, and this kind of perverse incentive need not exist only in education, it can exist anywhere. So at this point we will stop and we will summarize the lessons learned. So we looked at the set of educational terms, pedagogical terms, heterogogical, andragogical terms that we used in this set of lectures so far. We went through the whole thing, and then we looked at the definition of transformative learning. So we did a recap, plus we looked at a definition of transformative learning, and in that context we also had a discussion in the class, and students believed that transformative learning is a very important, very interesting and very meaningful paradigm even for engineering and science education. And there was this very interesting point given about positive reinforcement. If a student does the intended task, then it's a good idea for you to give some kind of incentive, but at the same time balance the incentive so that it doesn't become perverse, because there is always a danger of this happening. Okay, and some psychologists call it the cobra effect. Okay, because cobra is a very poisonous snake, it's also called the cobra effect. So this is an interesting thing. All right, so use positive reinforcement, and if there is a behavior that doesn't help with learning, then you can negatively reinforce that. And then you balance the positive and negative reinforcement so that there is no perverse incentivization. So this is sort of the kind of balance that an educator has to sort of bring about in their approach. What is another learning that you would say you had from the pedagogic discussions that we had? Sometimes the outcomes of a certain lesson learned takes years for you to appreciate, isn't it? you learnt about colors at one point, and that informed the way you actually made choices about your degrees and courses and so on. You learned some basic programming, and that informed the way you think about the rest of the world. Quite amazing, isn't it? How your mind is capable of abstracting out. You learnt about simple ways to explain very concrete but certainly difficult ideas from an NPTEL lecture, let us say, and that is now informing the way you yourself explain, you approach your activities and so on and so on. What may be another, just one more lesson that came out of your pedagogical discussions? One from here, that's all, and then we'll stop. Why don't you make a minute paper of it, and I will collect the minute paper at the end of this, okay? So you make a minute paper out of it. So to summarize, it is meaningful for us to set up a learning environment that is engaging and transformative for our students. So thank you very much, and we'll meet again in the next session of this SWAYAM course. Thank you.